Hello everybody and welcome back to the Overlap Breakdown channel. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Mohammed, who's a professional football scout and analyst, and we're here to analyse Mohammed Kudus' move to Tottenham Hotspur. Okay, good morning, welcome back to the channel, and we're covering quite an interesting move which probably been pending for a couple of seasons at Kudus. I think he maybe wanted to go after last season after, obviously an amazing season for West Ham. And yeah, this is a player who's sort of been, I think everyone's almost forgot how good he was the season before last because of how poor West Ham have been this season. And we'll get into that a little bit more later, more generally talking about him and his performance this season. But right off the rip, can you just tell me a little bit about Kudus, what his strengths and potential weaknesses are?
Yeah, he's a very versatile attacker. He can play across sort of the front line and sort of attacking midfield positions. I think, as we've spoken about in previous videos, that versatility is very sought after, especially because it provides depth all across the pitch. Generally, I think he's a very strong carrier of the ball, and his dribbling quality is great, in my opinion. We've seen that not only for West Ham at his best, but also, for Ghana. I think the last World Cup sticks out in my mind in particular. He likes to take responsibility and kind of play with some individualism, which is a pro and a con at times. But yeah, once he gets the ball, he can dribble past a few players, really strong, and keeps players off him. And then he likes to shoot a lot and play quite aggressively in terms of like trying to force the issue in the final third. So a very exciting attacker, a very versatile attacker, and one that it'll be interesting to see how Thomas Frank does utilise in his team.
Yeah, quite one of them players who's quite beautiful to watch on the eye. I think I remember he scored against Manchester United, I think it was last season, and remember just watching him in that game and sort of his ball carrying, he's very unique, he's very strong on the dribble, and he doesn't really look too, bulky and, he doesn't really look that big, but his ability to bounce off players is really good. He uses his body well, sticks his arms and his legs across and almost gives him the shoulder quite often, and he's very hard to sort of nudge off the ball. And I think one thing I can show you right now is sort of Mohammed Kudus' progressive carries map by Opta. We can see that he's got virtually carries everywhere. He's even got carries on the edge of his own box, which again sort of paints into that idea that West Ham have been very poor this season, and we need to stress that, as we'll go on to talk about it again in a minute. But not really too much sort of attacking the edge of the D, but a lot of clusters sort of on the flanks. And we can see again that when we look at his touch map, his touch map is really strange because he's got dark spots here, few bits in the middle, bit at fullback, and it looks really strange. And yeah, I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of Kudus at West Ham and why it's been so confusing. So, as per Transfer Market, he's played 9 games at left wing, 8 at centre forward, 7 in attacking midfield, 6 games at right wing, and other 5 I've got because he played in 5 different positions, as that website says. So like right midfield, left midfield, centre midfield, and it adds up to 5. So yeah, a really confusing sort of season for Kudus, and that has obviously left him with only 5 goals and 3 assists in the league, which is probably the immediate concern when Spurs fans sort of look at his return this year and sort of, paying the big bucks for him. And would you say there's any merit to that? I don't personally think there's too much merit to that.
Yeah, well, I think fans in general want to sign players on the up. Players who are kind of, we've seen him have a brilliant season. I want that player in my team. I actually think it's more sensible, especially in Spurs' position where they've got Champions League football, but they've come off of a poor season prior. They might not be the most alluring team to other players in general, but they need players of high quality to compete on all fronts. Players who perhaps aren't being profiled properly or who are in an environment where they've not sort of gelled or not had the best season, those are the kind of players that you want to kind of rehouse, empower, especially with Frank, who's brilliant at kind of looking at his team for what it is and making the team really balanced and accommodating for various players' strengths and weaknesses. So I think in that sense, it's a very astute buy because you're looking at a player who, at his best, for example, if he had carried on in the season prior's form last season, then you'd be looking at a player who's worth 90 or 100 million, in my opinion. I think his fee is a little bit steep for the season he's just had, for example. I do think there's some of that rivalry between West Ham and Spurs that's fueling that. But if you can get him around 50 million, I think that would be a brilliant buy, especially when you're looking at the fees that other wingers are going for. around that same price mark.
Yeah, I think I want something to show you here, which is attacking sequence involvement coming in from the 24-25 season. And even though he's only had 5 goals and 3 assists, we can see that Mohammed Kudus has got 145 attacking involvements, which is the most in the West Ham squad in its entirety. So even despite the great season that Jarrod Bowen has had this year, and believe me, it's a great season, factoring in everything we've just spoke about West Ham, he's top of the pack in terms of having either a pass, shot, build-up, carry, everything towards a goal, or towards a shooting opportunity, Yeah, I want to now speak about sort of how Thomas Frank will profile Kudus, or how we think he will profile Kudus. And obviously, Dejan Kulusevski got an injury towards the back end of last season, so I think this is almost not a stopgap for him, but someone who can come in and push the levels up immensely, and it won't drop off in terms of quality. The players were playing at right wing and stuff like that. So if we take Kudus' sort of best attributes and we take sort of what Frank wants to do, in the video we often spoke about, can we generate these sort of 4-2-4 situations with Dominic Solanke standing on the same line as James Maddison and tucking in here, taking the ball and generating, more importantly, the space in behind. And if this player drops here, can we get these runs that are swinging in behind? Brian Mbeumo become almost famous for it when I was watching Brentford, because it felt like every attack was manufactured that way. And I think Kudus is probably a player who can do that. He's very powerful. If we talk about, he's very nippy, doesn't mind the physicality against centre-backs in the Premier League. He's sort of very good at taking the ball and driving inside. And I can't stress enough, we've briefly covered it, I can't stress enough how good of a dribbler he actually is. I think if you look per 90 in comparison to Spurs, his forwards, he's got the most dribbles completed and the most duels won out of any player in the forward line for Spurs. And he's obviously only Jeremy Doku, has completed more successful take-ons in the Premier League than him. So we're talking about a world beater of a dribbler. Yeah. He's very much up there. Similar to Jamie Gittins, the only difference between them two teams is that Kudus is doing them here and Jamie Gittins is doing them all the way down there, which obviously leaves a lot to be desired in terms of
he's gone all the way to the bench.
So yeah, whilst Mohammed Kudus is doing a lot of his dribbles here, a player like Jamie Gittins, who has a lot of sort of these box penetrating dribbles, attacking the box vertically, Kudus is spending a lot of time doing these dribbles here for West Ham and almost being really wide on the touchline, handling contact, bringing the ball inside. But then, because West Ham are very much a deep team, both in possession and out of possession, it's very hard to get Kudus in sort of the impactful areas of the pitch, where I think a team like Tottenham under Thomas Frank will be a lot more, can we get to the box as fast as possible? But yeah, can you explain to me how you think this will work? I want you to obviously touch on as well the combinations you can have with Pedro Porro, as he most likely will return to this flying fullback role that he truly is. But yeah, how do you think he sort of stacks up in Spurs' system if he is to play right wing?
I think it's a good qualifier, because I think there's two ways to use him. If he does play right wing, I think what we'll see is trying to get him on the ball. I think your right winger always faces pressure from your opposition fullback on his back. The fact he's quite strong and can probably deal with that contact means he can transform into a different kind of player. I think sort of a Brennan Johnson in this instance is probably less likely to deal with that contact really well. With a left-footed player here, back to pressure, he can find his players inside a little bit more easily. And whether that's a Porro who's come a little bit inside, whether that's one of the double pivot players who's come across, resisting that pressure, finding a player here, and then having one of these movements, and then them playing it long is a scheme that I think we'll see if he does play there. Obviously, like you've touched on already, he can kind of receive the ball here. If there's a bit of separation, turn and start driving automatically in there, because he's got that great dribbling quality. And that's certainly how he might be used as a right winger, which is obviously not the most enlightening. There's all sort of two main ways that he'll be used. I do think he'll be able to cross the ball, but he's generally a player who, in my opinion, likes to
shoot
first, play with sort of a lot of touches, a lot of ball responsibility. His main qualities have been, in my opinion, this ability to carry and drive in these areas. And obviously in the big spaces, he can sort of do that from the wide areas, like Mbeumo did. But alternatively, I do think, let's say we've got a different winger out wide there. What we saw from Damsgaard as sort of that number 10 player was this ability to drop deep and be very sort of connected to this double pivot. And it often wasn't the double pivot who got many touches to bring the ball out and play. It was either progress from your fullbacks going longer, or from Damsgaard dropping in, picking it up and then carrying it. I think that utilises a lot of his quality, especially if he does it perhaps on this left-hand side with that left foot.
It's more favourable.
And carries it here, and then you've got perhaps someone like a Brennan Johnson here, or a Richarlison here, or a Kulusevski here, making those runs. And that difficulty in terms of turning that defence into attack, instead of having to do that solely through passing quality, you can do that through dribbling quality if Kudus is the player to play as that third midfielder. So again, that versatility, whether that's running in behind as a left winger, whether that's using your back to goal and driving, or passing it back from a right winger, or whether that's that carrying quality from central midfielder. There's certainly many options, and adaptability is the name of the game for Thomas Frank. So in his managerial quality, but also in the players that he wants to utilise.
Yeah, no, perfect. You kind of itched my brain now with something I wanted to talk about on Kudus, which was a bit more like, the more I'm thinking about him, the more I see him as sort of very, very similar to Kulusevski.
Yeah.
I think Kulusevski's more of sort of a kind of forward-facing carrier who's a bit more De Bruyne-like, as you like to say, who's a bit more of a straight line carrier. I think Kudus is a little bit more all over the show, kind of very agile on the turn. But when I think about Kudus, and if you think again to sort of the build-up shape that we saw at Brentford, I do think this position, him playing attacking midfield rather than out wide, he probably does get a bit more touches, a bit more impactful touches, and sort of maximises him a bit better. I'm trying to think, if I'm Thomas Frank, and he's, as you just said there, he's all about maximising his attackers. James Maddison's a very similar player in this role, and I'm not saying he's going to displace him, but this is the beauty of being a very versatile player, is that he could probably drop in here, pick up the ball, turn, face forward and run, and then we can pick out these runners ahead of him. He could probably sit on the right wing, make these outside to inside runs that we mentioned in the Thomas Frank episode. He could probably play false nine against the bigger teams where they're going to look to press him a little bit higher. He could probably pin a centre-half and have James Maddison off him, especially if we're going to use maybe like a Tell, Kulusevski, or a bit more powerful, attacking players. I think there's a lot to like about the signing. I think the versatility is, as we mentioned at the top of the video, is probably the key selling point. He's probably his unique selling point in terms of, can we play him right wing, 10, centre forward, left wing? Most probably. I mean, he's done it this season. Yeah. And whilst it's been in a pretty stagnant side who are missing a little bit of identity this season in West Ham, I do think Tottenham, and more importantly Thomas Frank, knows how to get the most out of his attackers. And I think when they first got linked to him, I was a bit confused, thinking, well, most likely he's going to play right wing, and that displaces Brennan Johnson and Kulusevski, who in my opinion are two very good players for Spurs. But then the more I was like, oh no, because he can play 10, he can play centre forward, he can play left wing.
And Kulusevski can also rotate in those positions as well.
I remember Kulusevski used to play up front for Juve. There's multiple dynamics to this transfer. I think it's a really exciting one. I think sounds weird in saying this, but it feels like a straightforward one for Spurs. Yeah. Feels like, well, we need depth across all forward positions. We need him to be a ball carrier. We need him to be experienced in the Premier League, handle contact.
Play off of a big man, for example. You think of Ivan Toney and Bremo, Solanke and Kudus could replicate some of that, even if they play more directly as a two, like you've mentioned. I mean, it does answer a lot of those questions, doesn't it?
Yeah, I just think it's a really straightforward signing. I will say there's not quite a lot of negatives. There are a few negatives about the signing, which are obviously coming off a really poor season. We will mention that there has been some murmurings in the West Ham fan base as to he down tools almost towards the back end of the season, because I think kind of West Ham had to sell a player, and I think he thought himself that he was going to be the one alongside maybe a Paqueta or someone like that. So I think there was sort of a bit of friction between him and the club, and obviously we can only say looking from the outside and how that's looking towards us as fans. But I think if you look at sort of the character he is when West Ham were flying, hopefully you get that same sort of character at Spurs where he gets the chair out and celebrates in front of the fans. So yeah, a very straightforward signing for Spurs. Do you want to touch on just a couple minutes on some of the negatives that we noticed?
Yeah, I mean, just if I'm talking about some things that you have to be wary of when you're putting him in your team, I do think he likes to play with a lot of touches, likes to feel involved. Perhaps that might be why he kind of down tools a little bit towards the end of that last season. I talk about him in a similar way I talk about Cunha, in the sense that almost these third midfielder profiles like to play with the ball, mazy dribblers. I think Cunha's a better shooter, for example.
A bit like Eze as well.
Yeah, a bit like Eze. Yeah. So these are players who, they enjoy football for what it is. They like to be at the centre of it. If he plays in this right wing position, can he tweak his game to play with a little bit fewer touches? That's a question that we'll have to see if it is answered. And then in general, I think he plays, he can slow down his dribble and go again. So there's a bit of variety in his pace of dribbling, but he's a fairly sort of proactive, direct attacker. He likes to run down the middle of the pitch, go towards goal. And then again, against a deeper defence, if Spurs are to pin teams in, how and where does he kind of slot in? I think Thomas Frank is brilliant in terms of how he looks at players and how he empowers them. Any of the personality concerns or the work rate concerns, I think, would be subsidized by Frank knowing how to kind of manage that. If I do talk about work rate, actually, he presses really well and aggressively when he is in sort of that mood. And we've seen it in seasons gone by for West Ham getting involved in sort of that defensive work as well. So generally, on the face of things, a good signing. It's just how do you manage sort of that maverick profile in the context of a greater team.
I would say you were mentioning sort of a touch-heavy player. I would consider James Maddison as someone who wants to get on the ball all the time. The more I'm thinking about it, the more I think he'll play inside naturally. I don't know what it is. I think idealistically, you probably think about Kudus and you go right winger. I think in this Frank team especially, I think you mentioned the sort of the connection he could have with Dominic Solanke. I actually quite fancy him inside.
That's a good, nice little duo, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm not displacing James Maddison. We're talking about him playing versatility. So if James Maddison's there, he'll go out there or even next to James Maddison, as we've touched on. So, yeah, I think it's a very good signing. I think it's one that Thomas Frank will know how to get the best out of. I think it's a player who, I don't know why, but I could just see him and Thomas Frank getting along really well and it being a really good connection. I think he'll take to the Spurs fans really well. I think Spurs have always been this club that have these players who are so gorgeous to watch on the eye, and they really do appreciate them despite how many goals or assists they get. So I think it suits Tottenham really well. I think it's come at the right time for Tottenham, right time for West Ham, and the right time for Kudus. And I think this could be the start of a very impressive sort of shift under Thomas Frank and Spurs. So yeah, really excited about this one. I'm a big fan, and every time he plays us, he looks incredible. So I know that's not hard, but yeah. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy, please don't forget to like, comment and follow the channel, and let us know what you think about Kudus to Spurs, and we'll see you next week on the Overlap Breakdown.